So I want to move on for the remainder of this episode to talk about how China and the Chinese media is handling Ukraine, twisting it, but also trying to stay out of the chaos. And then I just want to look at Taiwan and kind of what some, I guess, different perspectives are on what could be next for Taiwan. So I want to start with something interesting that I learned. The Foreign Policy magazine had a great article today, but it mentioned at one point that those big Hong Kong protests that we saw in 2019 and 2020 were actually inspired by the protests in Kyiv, mainly the independence protests in Kyiv in the mid 2010s. And I think that may be telling on a lot of reasons. There's a reason why I'm starting with that. But, anyways, foreign policy basically talks about how propaganda departments in China, in Beijing specifically, have been working for years to portray the United States and parts of the West, but mainly the United States, as Beijing's main enemy. And let's be honest, the Russian invasion, which I think is bigger than Ukraine or NATO, I think it's more of a kind of a tension with America. And the Chinese media have really been able to bounce on the narrative that Putin is just this hero standing up to NATO and America. And there's media outlets like Ximian, which is obviously state-owned and part of Beijing News. They apparently, a couple weeks ago, accidentally posted an internal message which said not to post anything unfavorable to Russia and pro-Western. So clearly internally they've been told don't cover anything that makes Russia look bad. Now, there's a big conversation, I think, to be had about what do these Chinese elites actually think. Are they all completely convinced that Russia's on the right here, or are they just saying it and actually quite concerned about what's happening? I don't actually know, because I don't know enough about how information travels even amongst the elites in China. Now, it's very clear that the people in China have sided with Russia just because I think of the information they're getting. But I do wonder if the elites know better or not. Anyways, so that was a few weeks ago, where the message was clearly like nothing pro-democracy, nothing pro-West. Make sure we at least are milquetoast or neutral on Putin. But as the war progresses, Foreign Policy writes here, the guidelines are shifting from day to day. Sources at 3 state-affiliated Chinese media outlets describe the shifts to me as, we follow the political stance taken by the Chinese government. So yeah, I mean, I don't know if that's much of a change, but apparently the bigger issue here is that, as I mentioned at the top of this segment, that there's a huge connection actually between what the Taiwanese people saw happen in Kyiv in, I think, 2014, 2015, and what they feel needs to happen in Taiwan. And so the Chinese government clearly doesn't want to add positive light to what's happening in Ukraine. So they are trying to basically control any narrative that makes the Ukrainian people look like freedom fighters, or make them look like people that are standing up against an evil dictator, basically, which I think we can agree is probably the truth here. But Foreign Policy writes, they don't want any, I can't speak English, but Foreign Policy writes that they don't want any coverage to have a message of anti-war or peaceful protest. The biggest no-go zone is relating Russian events to domestic ones in China, especially Taiwan. The media is not allowed to show any civil movements or online petitions. And this is where it kind of worries me a little bit. Well, I mean, a lot of things worry me, as we should just call this podcast Everything Worries Me, basically. But because the media doesn't want to cover anything that may get them in trouble with the Chinese government, they're basically choosing not to cover issues at all. That's what I've been reading more and more over the last few days, is because they don't know what's really acceptable to the Putin government, they're just saying, fuck it, we're not gonna cover anything. And in my opinion, this has kind of led to the majority of the Chinese people being pro-Russian. Not really, maybe because all of them agree. I mean, I'm sure your average Chinese person, if they were actually given all the information here, would think that it was quite desperate in Ukraine right now. And last night I was just watching like the midnight news, and I saw they were playing a clip from from Chinese state television from like a week ago, and they were talking about how Putin's small offensive into eastern Ukraine had been successful, President Zelensky fled from Kyiv as a coward. The West has been backing him. It was just a completely bullshit story. And, if that's all you're allowed to cover, it's either you cover that or you don't cover anything, then I think people are going to have a wrong message here. And it's just too bad because instead of covering even neutral opinions, they're not covering anything. So no one knows what's happening in China from what I've gathered. And we must remember as well that the Chinese government for years has been playing the victim, calling the U.S. the bad guy. And this is all just working in their favor. And it's just too bad because there's no good faith conversations going on inside of China. Now, I'm going to get to it in the next little portion here about Taiwan because I still don't think this actually says that China's taking any significant stance of actually defending what Putin is doing in Russia. But it's clear to them that their agenda and what the nation wants is better if they support what Putin's doing, if that makes sense. I wanted to just add that probably the most telling personal anecdote that I've seen out of China, and it was reported, is on February 26th, there was a peace-provoking article, according to Foreign Policy, which was signed by China's top scholars from 5 major universities, and it was published by the WeChat account. I'm not going to try to pronounce it. I'm sorry. Yeah. It's better if I just say it was published by a WeChat account. But anyways, the article immediately received a lot of criticism and was blocked within 2 hours. I was reading a little bit more on it earlier, and basically the article was talking about how we completely feel pain for the Ukrainian people, and what Russia's doing is atrocious, and we beg Vladimir Putin to stop. Not really that uncontroversial, right? Pretty rational, I think, for most human beings. But again, I will just reiterate, the Chinese people are not seeing what's happening on the ground. They're not seeing genuine news coverage. And that's the root of this issue. I don't think there's any reason to condemn China or the people of China. But the government should be condemned because the people are not being told what's happening. And the worry is that over time, I think China, by being silent on this and portraying Putin as the hero, it probably means that they're okay with what he's doing, or at least the elite government is. So before we're out of here, I just wanted to briefly talk about Taiwan and kind of where the current implications are for Taiwan. A lot of people, myself included, were worried that China was maybe going to use what's happening in Ukraine as a pretext to reconsider how they're going to strategically handle Taiwan, which could mean annexation, invasion, whatever terms you want to use. But so far, it seems like China understands that would not be a good call. Good news that I've seen over the last 24 hours is that there's been no unusual movements by Chinese aircrafts or forces near Taiwan, and it seems like China is not going to do anything brash. And, it's not really hard right off the bat to think about some of the parallels, between World War II. You have this kind of axis of autocratic regimes around the world that may see what Putin is doing as a way to enact their own versions of that. And I was worried about that. Believe me, I've talked about it with friends, and it seems like so far China is a lot less volatile. And while their propaganda is on Russia's side, I don't think they want a huge conflict in Taiwan. I don't think at this point that there's really an issue with China trying to invade Taiwan. Barron's actually has a good point that kind of talks about that, and it talks about how, Taiwan is a very important global actor. This is no dig at Ukraine, but they have a much different status in the world than Ukraine in terms of what would happen if you invaded Taiwan. The semiconductors, which there's a shortage of. Imagine if China invaded Taiwan, what that would do to the global economy if we already have a shortage and serious issues with the semiconductors in Taiwan, right? And I think it would hurt Xi's bigger aspirations. And this Barron's article talks about here in quotes, Taiwan plays a much more central role in the global economy as the heart of the semiconductor industry. It is also geopolitically different in the delicate U.S.-China balance and to U.S. allies in Asia, which requires a different calculus. Conflict would jeopardize Xi's broader policy goals, not least because it would cut the country off from the rest of the world before it is self-reliant on various fronts, including critical technology. And the thing is we have such a global world, and I know there's escalating tensions between China and the United States, trade wars, rhetoric, etc. COVID has definitely not helped that. But China's not self-reliant yet. Now, I've read reports that they are working on getting more towards that aim. But at the same time, that's just not the status we're in right now. And I think also Xi is looking at the sanctions, to be completely honest, that have hit Russia and how brutal they've been for markets and for the Russian economy, even though Putin doesn't seem to care as of now, at least. And these type of sanctions, I think, would put China on a very bad path, and I think Xi recognizes that. I also think that Xi understands that actually the Taiwanese people have learned a lesson from this Ukrainian invasion, and they are probably a lot more prepared, or at least working to be prepared for this to happen. And so I just don't really see it being something that could happen at this moment, at least. And NBC News also has a good article from yesterday about how the Taiwanese president, Chi Ing-wen, I apologize if I'm mispronouncing that, but she said last week that the military must heighten surveillance and be more involved in watching Chinese movements. The article also discusses how officials say their fears of imminent Chinese invasion are unfounded for a number of reasons. Apparently, experts and Taiwanese officials say geography is something very different. You know, while Ukraine and Russia share a huge border, over 1,000 miles, Taiwan is, as you all know, just by looking at a map, Taiwan is separated by about 100 miles of water. So if the Chinese were going to invade, you could easily see it from a significant distance. And I think the world would be much more on alert. And again, I don't think Xi wants this right now because China's about trying to win over the West. Winning over the West wouldn't involve a giant ground and, I guess in this case, water invasion. It just wouldn't make sense in this case. And this is not me defending China, believe me. That is not the purpose of this segment. But it is just saying that I don't think China has that in their mind right now. Now, we must remember, though, that about a month ago, China and Russia did sign a mutual shared interest agreement that clearly was a demonstration of unity amongst all odds. And that is something to keep in the back of your head. And I think that was why I've been concerned in some ways, is because, of course, they're not focused on taking Taiwan right now. I don't think that was ever the case. They've obviously been working more on intimidation with Taiwan. But China's growing ties with Russia have also raised fears, obviously, for Taiwan, because there was a joint statement where President Xi and Putin did sign this statement in Beijing in February, right before the Olympics, and it did reiterate its opposition to any form of independence. Like, clearly these countries have similar interests. I just think that Putin is not mentally well, and he's just acting more brashly because I don't think he completely sees a great future for his regime, while China knows that they could win the future. And that is probably why this disconnect is happening. Again, we do need to watch this because I do wonder, like, obviously we're only in the first week of all this. I do wonder now in a month or so what China is maybe reassessing on the ground there. But at the moment, I think Taiwan is okay. Going full circle, I think it's been a disservice to everyone that China is not covering this correctly. I think it's important for people to make their own minds, but that's a bigger meta-analysis of my issues with China in general. Anyways, I want to thank you guys for listening. As always, you can find me on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, iTunes, Podbean, Spotify, all that jazz. I'll be back tomorrow, going to cover domestic issues. Not going to talk about Ukraine for a day. Biden's State of the Union is starting right now, so I'm going to watch that and get to you guys tomorrow with my thoughts on that and some other special election news from Texas and whatever else maybe comes up. So take care, have a great night, and we'll see you guys tomorrow.